Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a real shoot 'em up when I put Robert Aldrich's The Grissom Gang versus Richard Linklater's The Newton Boys. And, this one was a fun one to get through. Both movies kind of take place around the same kind of time period and deal with criminal elements. So let's dive right on in to the first one. We have The Grissom Gang, directed by Robert Aldrich, who, of course, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, and definitely somebody that was always pushing boundaries, even working in the 50s and throughout the 60s, and then the 70s. He really got to do some really intense stuff, and The Grissom Gang is no exception to that. This is probably one of the more intense movies that he made in the 70s, and the film centers around this basic socialite, rich girl played by Kim Darby, a Barbara Blandish. And these guys find out like, oh, she's gonna have all these jewels on that are worth a lot of money, so let's go, kidnap her and all this stuff. So they kidnap this heiress, and the two dudes that do it originally, one of them's Matt Clark. They end up getting killed by the Grissom Gang, and then they end up taking the girl, and then they end up trying to get the ransom for it and everything. But the biggest complication is Scott Wilson, who plays Slim, ends up falling in love with her, and he's all smitten and everything. So he's trying to basically keep them from killing her, because the head of the pack, Ma Grissom, played intensely by Irene Daly. She's got a little snarl and everything, like, you don't want to fuck with this bitch. Like, she's real adamant about they're going to kill the girl. And you got Tony Masante, who plays Eddie in the film. Like, this dude's really on track. Like, he's either trying to fuck her or kill her, And so, like, Scott Wilson has to deal with all, and Scott Wilson himself is a fucking psycho. If anything, just a simpleton, But the whole gang is fucking ruthless as hell. But honestly, for as ruthless as the Grissom Gang is, they're no more ruthless than the father of the Kim Darby character, Wesley Addy, who was a staple in a lot of Robert Aldrich's films, most notably like Kiss Me Deadly. He's one of the associates, basically, And so this guy hires fucking Dave Fenner, played by Robert Lansing. And this guy, pretty intense looking dude. He's definitely there to get the job done, but he's still not as ruthless as fucking Wesley Addy is. Because that ending is what really fucking, like, sets the tone for this movie. Because, like, they go through all this shit, they got all this money, so then they got this little gambling hall and all this stuff. And they shoot it out with the cops in this gambling hall. Of course, fucking Slim ends up killing Eddie because he's banging or trying to bang Kim Darby, and then he kills him, runs off, and then ends up getting there right before this shootout happens. They get away essentially, and then the whole family gets gunned down by the cops, and then essentially then there's another showdown in the end where Scott Wilson finally meets his end. Very violent film, definitely kind of like taking a card from Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde. This one kind of sets it up though harder, because there's not really anybody that's sympathetic in this movie. Like there's nobody in this film where you're like, that guy is a really nice guy. No matter what side of the law they're on, they're all fucking shit. And that ending too, where you see the Barbara Lansing character played by Kim Darby, when she sees Slim, the Scott Wilson character, dead at the end, she's crying over the body, and that is very disgusting to her father, who's, just get away from him. Is like, and the Thinner will deal with you. Like, he just kind of, in a way, disowns his daughter, because he's like, well, you were fucking him, and it's like, she's trying to stay alive. In his mind, he cannot understand that, and it's so disgusting to him, and just the contempt on his face is what packs the punch of this film. Like I said, the whole film moves like a fucking bullet, and it's acid, it's very acidic. These motherfuckers don't play, they're ruthless, and as much were some of the films of Robert Aldrich. And then we move forward to Richard Linklater's The Newton Boys, which is based on a true story about a group of brothers who were bank robbers, for the most successful bank robbers. They were in the 20s, and they come from Texas, Uvalde area, and the cast is perfect. You got Matthew McConaughey, Ethan Hawke, Skeet Ulrich, and Vincent D'Onofrio playing the Newton boys. And, you know, they get a whole list of banks to rob. They plan it, you know, they got Dwight Yoakam as their fucking dynamite guy. You know, he's got the nitroglycerin, so you get one mistake with that shit. And then, you know, and Juliana Margulies is in it, looking lovely. She's the love interest for McConaughey in this film. And the film is very well made. You know, Richard Linklater is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And of course, you know, his attention to detail and the work that he does with his actors is very impressive, you know. But I will say with this film, it is a little too nice. You know, granted, it is based on a true story. And then, you know, these guys, where you see them in the footage and in the end credits where they're talking about their exploits as old men. And, you know, it was just rare thing is like these, you know, most outlaws never got to live to a ripe old age. And these gentlemen did. And so, you know, in a way, it's a nice story. It's very touching, you know, and how, like, you know, these guys didn't kill anybody. You know, they just wanted to rob banks to get money, you know, because, like, you know, that specifically that point in time, you know, it's for dirt farmers, you know, nobody gives you any money type shit, you know, and bank robbers essentially do turn out to be folk heroes. Definitely, it's a more honorable profession than kidnapping, you know, because kidnapping, in a way, is some of the dumbest shit you can fucking do, you know, and of course, that's when you really see the shitty in human beings, is when you go and you delve into the kidnapping. And Newton boys didn't do that shit. The Grissom gang sure as hell did. But, you know, the thing about it is where the cast is enjoyable, and, you know, it's not even that fun of a film, I guess you could say. You know, it honestly would play better if you just read the book about these guys, or if it like was some kind of docu-series and stuff. But he does also bring in some really good background characters too. You got Bo Hopkins is the guy that's been, you know, following these dudes, and then, you know, fucking Luca Skew pops up in this shit, you know, and there's a lot of like great attention to detail. You know, the look of the film is great too, you know, but it's just kind of, you know, kind of bland when you really think of, compared to the Grissom gang, because the Grissom gang, for as fucked up as those characters, you want to hang out with the Newton boys, but you're really fascinated by the Grissom gang, because like, well, the beauty of the 70s was like how they could just delve into the shittiness of human beings and make that shit entertaining. Like that it was a hell of a feat, you know. It's a lot easier to watch people that are fun, that you want to hang out with and shit, but it takes like a real cinematic artist to make you intrigued by the people that you wouldn't want to even cross the street if you saw them coming and shit. So this round clearly has to go to the 70s, because like, for as much as the Newton Boys is a good movie, the Grissom gang packs more of a punch. It's more memorable, you know. Honestly, the Newton Boys is kind of forgettable, and, you know, as are most of these like historical dramas like that, you know. And of course, even a director like Linklater can only do so much with the material. You know, he clearly was fascinated by these guys and admired them in a way, and we see that in the film. But it's just a lot more better to see shitty people on the screen, in my opinion. So that, for anybody keeping score, that's 41-33. 70s are up by 8. They're back kicking ass again. It looked like the 90s were coming back, and who knows? They still can. We still got a long way to go. And I wouldn't say a short time to get there. I got all the time in the world to do this shit. I'm not in a hurry, but I got to know. So you'll see some of these bonus rounds pop up. And as long as if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. I don't care. Like I said, this is a scientific obsession. You know, I'm just having fun with this. I really don't care about anything, internet, interwebs, whatever the hell. You know, it's all about the cinema. You know, the cinema is king. And when it came to this great cinema, the 70s and the 90s had a fucking barrage of great cinema. But it looks like this, I may have been right, the 70s just packed more of a punch, you know, than the 90s. So stay tuned for all that stuff coming up. 41-33, 70s are up by 8. Like I said, could have been right all along, but still got a long way to go, and I could be proven wrong. So I'm excited for that.